All right, guys, welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. DeSico. Today, we're going to take you through the 1950s. It's kind of right in the heart of the Cold War. And as we begin to look at these individual events, you're going to find that some of them are going to raise tensions with the Soviet Union, and some of them are going to reduce tensions or ease those tensions within the Soviet Union. So just remember that Cold War is that competition between the United States and the Soviet Union over influence around the globe. So let's get it going. There's Eisenhower. He's going to be a president from the 1950s. And within that kind of whole decade, the Cold War really intensified and spread to new areas of the world that weren't really being tested until then. So the new economic prosperity allowed Americans to enjoy some extra time, some greater wealth, more than their parents. It was kind of an era where people were really enjoying themselves post-World War II. We will also discuss later on the Civil Rights Movement and how that really intensified as African Americans were searching for equality and justice in terms of their daily lives in America. So we'll see that later on. But we're going to look at the Cold War in terms of the United States versus the Soviet Union and what both those countries were experiencing in the early 50s. So the United States simply was the strongest nation in the world after World War II. We had really controlled the atomic bomb. For a short time, we were the only ones who had the atomic bomb. And our economy was really undamaged because of World War II. And, most of those other, war-torn nations in Europe, they really didn't have the economic prosperity that America did in the 1950s. So our rival, the Soviet Union, they are going to become our biggest enemy from 1945 until 1950. So by 1949, what happened, they had, experimented with their sciences, and they actually had also created the atomic bomb. So by 1950, they have the atomic bomb, and so do we. The Soviet Union really had those satellite nations, and you should have seen a map about that. They controlled all of those nations in the eastern part of Europe, and they were looking to spread communism to other places. And if you can remember what our policy was one of containment. And we said that we are going to limit the spread of communism. We never said we're going to get rid of it. We said we're going to keep it where it is. And that might take money. It might take our military. It might take our policies. So we'll see those. Quick timeline so you just kind of get a feel for what's happening in the Cold War. We know that the Korean War began in 1950. That's when the Cold War went hot. 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the architect of D-Day, was elected president. By 52, end of 52, so really 3 years, the Korean War comes to an end, and Eisenhower is credited with that. There is a summit in Geneva that we in the Soviet Union will meet at, and I'll tell you about that later on. There's a Suez crisis that ended up badly in a Hungarian revolt that we didn't maybe do what we should have done there, but we'll see that event. 1959, Cuba becomes a communist country. So communism seems to be spreading in Latin America. And then in 1960, the end of this presentation here, we're going to find a very bad event for the United States. The Soviet Union shot down one of our spy planes. So a quick little checklist of some major events that are happening. So let's take a peek at Eisenhower's presidency. All right, he really continued the policy of containment, except he wanted to do like containment on steroids. So his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, came up with some new ideas to push the Soviet Union around. We're going to look at those in three different ways here. So John Foster Dulles is the foreign affairs guy, Secretary of State. And he comes up with a few ideas for Eisenhower, and he's advising Eisenhower, here's what you should do to defeat the Soviet Union. So it comes in this bundle of massive retaliation. So we throw that term around. Really, there's three parts to it. So let's look at those. America's new look. We are going to rely on air power and nuclear weapons, not ground troops. So if there was a problem somewhere, we kind of announced that we're going to be using these other weapons, not necessarily sending troops, which is pretty scary because if we use nuclear weapons, so will the Soviet Union. He announces that he was considering using nuclear weapons to stop the communist aggression, to contain it. So we kind of made that threat. And then finally, he announces this thing called brinksmanship. He said that the United States would be willing to go to the brink of war simply to preserve peace. So Dulles was kind of he's kind of throwing it out there to the Soviet Union. We are ready to go to war. Now, we didn't want that, but we made them think that we wanted that. And Dulles was a genius at kind of doing this in the early 50s. We were able to push the Soviet Union around, and they kind of backed off. We'll see a few events like that coming up. So you should be aware of that idea of massive retaliation in the Cold War. So there's John Foster Dulles. The ability to get to the verge without getting into war is necessary. If you're scared to go, you are lost. So the Soviets were scared. We told them we wanted to go to war, and they backed off. So we'll see that come to fruition in the early 50s, not in the late 50s. So what happens here is something known as the arms race, and that is we're not gathering a bunch of people's arms. We're going to gather more weapons than the enemy. And the idea is that if you stockpile a bunch of nuclear and non-nuclear weapons, and you have more weapons than the enemy will not go to war with you because you're going to win, because you simply have more weapons. So as we begin building more of these nuclear and non-nuclear weapons, obviously so did the Soviet Union. So in 52, we tested a hydrogen bomb, which was 750 times more powerful than the atom bomb. And strangely enough, the Soviet Union does it the next year. So we have this more powerful weapon, so they get the more powerful weapon, right? Both nations began building missiles at a rate that you could not even imagine, right? So what happens later on is, I had a little political cartoon for you, right? This is the U.S. symbol. We're building missiles, but so is the Soviet Union. And once again, he who has the most missiles will win the Cold War. So arms race continued. What Eisenhower came up with as this was happening is in 1953, the United Nations would be in charge of every country and would supervise each nation to find out what they're doing with their nuclear power. Well, we come up with this idea so that somebody could keep an eye on these things, and the Soviet Union refuses to participate. And once again, what does that kind of do? It kind of puts us at odds with the Soviet Union because they don't want to do it. One technological advancement that the Soviets had that the United States did not is something known as SPUTNIK. All right, and what that was the very first satellite that was put into space in 1957. Who did it? The Soviet Union. Who did not do it? The United States. So it looked like maybe we were ahead in the arms race. We were building more missiles, but they're ahead in the space race. Their technologies were more superior than ours. So the arms race then turns into what's known as the space race, and that is what we need to do is catch up. So, they put a satellite in space, they put an astronaut in space, and we claim that we're going to put a man on the moon. And by 1969, we do that. So it takes us a few years, but we have to kind of Johnny one-up them. If they do something, we have to do something a little bit better. So just understand that each one of the next 10 things we talk about on this presentation here are all parts of the Cold War. They're doing something, so we're doing something. It's kind of this back and forth. So there is the first satellite called Sputnik, right? What are we doing in Asia? Well, we already dealt with the Korean War, so we don't have to worry about that. But China became a communist country in 1949. So communism seems to be expanding in Asia. Cuba became a communist country. So communism seems to be expanding in Latin America. And we came out publicly and said we were going to contain it. So some areas were successful and some areas were not. The war in Korea was a military draw, but what we did do in Korea was stop the spread of communism. We said we would, and we did. We did not stop the spread of communism in China. So we had a success in Asia and a failure in Asia. All right. So what comes out of that whole Korea and China issue is the domino theory. So I'm going to show you the map here. The red is expanding here. China became a communist country, right? But we talked about the Iron Curtain before. This is known as the bamboo curtain, kind of the area separating communism in Asia from non-communism in Asia. And the theory came to be, well, what if that red began to expand? Well, if it went to China, maybe it's going to end up in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and Burma and India, and we really don't want that to spread. So we come out with a policy, a theory known as the domino theory. You should define this after because this is huge. And we believed it to be true in 1954. It turns out not to be true, but we believed it. All right, so what is it? Americans were worried that communism is going to spread in Asia, in other parts of Asia besides China. Well, what's our policy? Eisenhower states we need to stop the expansion of communism. So Eisenhower comes up with this domino theory. And what it was is nations in Asia were like a row of dominoes. And if one more country became a communist country, then the rest are going to follow. The rest will fall. So if you follow that logic, America needed to do whatever we needed to do to halt that first domino. We cannot let another country become a communist country. And you will see that come to full fruition in Vietnam. All right. So there's your vocabulary. If you want to pause the slide to get that definition of domino theory, you're more than welcome to. We're going to continue. Couple issues here in the Middle East and then Latin America, and we'll finish up with back with the Soviet Union. So these are going to be fast hits, but these are all little things that are going on. So Dulles, John Foster Dulles, pushes for the creation of SEATO. And what is that? Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. A bunch of nations in Southeast Asia that were kind of band together to halt communist expansion. And, you know, those countries who are listed, those countries joined into that, and they pledged to help their neighbors. So if your neighbor is being attacked by communism, all of those other nations would come to their aid. And, of course, who's in that? Great Britain and, of course, the United States. So that's another alliance that is in Southeast Asia, all right? So when you look at those purple countries down there, you know, those are all part of the SEATO agreement, and those are going to band together. And if one of those nations is attacked, all the other nations would help them. It kind of looks like NATO, if you remember the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's over here. SEATO is going to be these countries down over here. So our foreign policy in the Middle East. So we'll deal with Iran and Egypt, Lebanon, and a few other nations in there. There were several outbreaks of trouble. We'll call that trouble. I should have that in quotes for you, right? Well, what's trouble in the Middle East? Our fear is that there's a chance that communism will spread there. So we'll deal with Iran. In 1954, the Iranian prime minister tried to nationalize the oil industry. And what did we do? We had to get in there because oil is important, right? The United States, through the CIA, overthrew that prime minister and returned the Shah to power in Iran. And that will become a huge issue in the Iranian hostage crisis in the late 1970s. So our actions in the 1950s here caused a huge problem in the 1970s. So kind of don't forget that, right? Well, what did we do? We secured the oil, but we will have problems with Iran in years to come because we intervened. Maybe we shouldn't have, okay? Egypt. Well, Egypt really wanted some support from the United States and the Soviet Union to build and construct this Aswan Dam. Well, the United States withdrew its support for that. Our relationship with Egypt went down, and who are they going to go to? They're simply going to go to the Soviet Union for help them. So the Soviet Union seems to be gaining more friends in the Middle Eastern area. So what's Eisenhower come up with? Well, we had the Truman Doctrine, we had the Monroe Doctrine, now we have the Eisenhower Doctrine. We said in 1957 that we would help any Middle Eastern country that was resisting communism because we simply didn't want it to spread in the Middle East. So the last country we'll deal with is Lebanon. In 1958, Lebanon and Jordan asked for help. And the Eisenhower Doctrine is now tested. We said we would help them. Now, are we going to commit to that? And we did send troops to Lebanon to maintain order in there and to keep communism out. So we were willing to kind of put our money and our military where our mouth was. Eisenhower said he would do it, and he did. And Great Britain then sent troops to Jordan to do the same thing. So we seem to be, using our money, using our military to halt that expansion of communism. So there's three instances or problems in Latin America for Eisenhower, and that is, we know that Cuba turned to communism. Could other countries? They certainly could. So in Guatemala, there was a little stage covert operation to halt the communist movement in Guatemala, and we arranged through that covert op to topple that communist-friendly government and promote a more American democratic-friendly government, right? Also, Richard Nixon, who was not the president yet, but he will go on a tour of Latin America, kind of a goodwill tour, these are called. And what he wants to do is promote the types of government that we would like to see, obviously not a communist government. Good. We call it a goodwill tour. James Monroe did this in 1824 when he became president. Another country, other presidents tend to do this simply to kind of show our strength and maintain our friendship. So what happened in Peru and Venezuela is that when we showed up, those nations were not too American friendly because of our actions a long time ago. And mobs showed up, threw rocks and eggs at Nixon's limousine, and it didn't really look like they wanted America to be involved there. So we know that there were strong anti-American feelings in Latin America. Now that's coming back to bite us because of our intervention back in the late 1800s. So think of imperialism. Think of what we did to those countries back in the late early 1900s. Now they may tend to be more friendly to the Soviet Union, right? So there you got Nixon's tour and what's happening there, right? There's Nixon's limousine. See what they did to it? Crazy. They really want America getting involved in there, did they, right? Cuba. Well, what happens? In 1956, Fidel Castro revolts against the Cuban leader, Fulgencio Batista, and, 1959, Castro won. The U.S. had to recognize him as the new leader. Castro had developed policies that weren't really American. They weren't really democratic. He limited civil liberties, was putting political opponents in jail, nationalizing industries, and he went to the Soviet Union for help. Well, a lot of Cubans left Cuba, and we gladly took them in because it made us look good. But what Castro did is really move to more of a communist-type government, and that angered us because that was really close to our American border. It's 90 miles from Florida. So us and Cuba for a long time are not going to have a good relationship. And in the 60s, we're going to find some missiles there that led us to really worry about our safety at home. So there's Fulgencio Batista, and there is Fidel Castro. So he was a leader for a very long time in Cuba, right? Our relationships did change. Let's switch gears from the Latin America now. Those are your three instances. But our relationships with the Soviet Union sometimes were good, sometimes were bad in the 1950s. So they went up and down in the 1950s. That should be down. I'll fix that for you. Well, there was a new Soviet leader in 1953. Stalin dies, and Nikita Khrushchev, who was they called him a hardliner. He was a very strong pro-Soviet Union leader, and they focused on improving their own economic conditions. They weren't too involved in world affairs until the missile crisis, and the tensions kind of eased up. They were doing their thing, we were doing our thing, and there really wasn't a huge issue there. So what comes out of that is something known as peaceful coexistence. And when you look at that, it's like, hey, you could have communism and we could have democracy, and we really could coexist in the world together without war, without problems. So relationships between those two superpowers began to get better. And really they get better when we get to sit down and talk rather than in fighting, right? So in 55, there was something known as the Geneva Summit. It happened in Switzerland. A bunch of countries got together to talk about, hey, we have a ton of weapons. It might be a good idea to get rid of some of these weapons. Simple philosophy here. If there's less weapons, there's less a chance of a war. Right? So what those two nations did was they talked about doing that, which was good. They didn't do it, but they did talk about doing it. But they did suspend any new nuclear testing. I mean, we have the H-bomb. We certainly don't need the Z-bomb. Right? And then once again, an H-bomb has never been used. So the tensions were going down, and then there's certain instances where tensions begin to go up. So we're going to take a look at Poland, Hungary, Camp David, and the U2 incident. So what happens in Poland? Well, a bunch of Polish workers rioted because they were angry at the communist government. And actually in Poland, it worked for them. The communist government gave them some concessions. We stayed out of it because things were happening on their own in Poland, and it was working out, so we really didn't need to intervene. Now, demonstrations were made in Hungary by students and workers. And with the Soviet Union, they did not give them concessions. They did not help those people. The Soviet Union rolled in with the military. There's tanks rolling down like the main street of it was terrible. And they really just told the people, you're going to do what we tell you to do. And those poor people in Hungary asked for help. And they thought the Americans would come to their aid because we said we would, and we did not. So Things were okay in Poland, things were not okay in Hungary, and we did not want to risk going to a huge war, so we kind of did not help the Hungarians during that time period. It was pretty bad. Camp David, 1959. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, and the American leader, Dwight D. Eisenhower, meet at Camp David. Camp David is the presidential retreat in Maryland. It's a little log cabin. So they met and they said, "Hey, let's get together to talk so we can really relax." So it was good that they were discussing things. They said, "We're going to have another summit in Paris one next year. Let's keep talking. Let's keep tensions going in the right direction." And what happens after Camp David? Tensions are going down. Things are okay between the United States and the Soviet Union. And then, of course, when something good happens, something bad happens. So there's Eisenhower, Khrushchev at the little cabin. They're both laughing. Tensions are down. There's no chance of a war. Things are good. Now, what brings tensions up? When we get caught doing something. So before the Paris summit, before that summit in 1960, there was an incident, and it was an absolute disaster. We were spying on the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union shot down our plane, and they got our pilot, and we had to admit that we were spying on them, and it made us look really bad. And what could you imagine are happening with tensions after that incident? Tensions are going to go up. So as you begin to study this, make sure you know those little events happening in the 1950s that either rose tensions or brought them down.